Do you ever have one of those moments where you wish you just stayed in bed? Yeah, that was me a few months ago. The thought still hits me sometimes, usually around dusk when the shadows start getting long and my mind wanders back to that night at Wolf Creek Reserve. I've been trying to make sense of it ever since, though I'm not sure anyone could. My name's Sam Huxley, and I was a park ranger at Wolf Creek for 6 years. Notice I said was. These days I spend my time up north, as far from West Virginia as I could reasonably get without crossing into Canada. But let me back up a bit, because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand Wolf Creek itself. The reserve sits in a forgotten corner of West Virginia, one of those places that time seemed to skip over. It's mostly dense pine forest, the kind where the trees grow so close together they block out most of the sunlight, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor. A river cuts through it like a jagged scar, eventually spilling into what we called Mirror Lake, though it's really more of a glorified pond. The locals mostly stayed away, which was fine by me. After what happened with my brother, I wasn't much for company anyway. Mike, that was my brother's name. He died of pancreatic cancer 2 years before all this went down. It was quick, brutally quick. By the time they caught it, it had already spread everywhere. I was working at Wolf Creek when he got sick, and I told myself I couldn't leave my post, that someone had to watch over the park. The truth is, I was scared to watch him waste away, scared to face what was happening. By the time I finally worked up the courage to take some leave, he was already gone. That guilt, it eats at you, you know? Like rust on metal, slowly corroding everything it touches. The job helped in its way. There's something therapeutic about being alone in nature, about having nothing but trees and sky for company. Most days, my biggest concern was making sure the few hikers who wandered through didn't leave their trash behind or start fires where they shouldn't. The occasional black bear would show up, but they generally kept their distance. It was peaceful, predictable work. That Thursday started like any other. I arrived for the evening shift just as the day ranger, Bill Martinez, was finishing up his rounds. Bill was an old-timer, been with the Park Service longer than I'd been alive. He had this way of moving through the forest like he was part of it, barely making a sound even with all his gear. Quiet day, he told me as he was packing up his stuff. Couple of hikers on the North Trail, but they headed out around noon. Weather's supposed to turn nasty tonight. I nodded, going through my pre-shift routine of checking equipment, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, the usual stuff. Any word on those sounds people been talking about? Bill shrugged, but there was something in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Nothing concrete, but, he paused, choosing his words carefully, just keep your eyes open tonight, Sam. Something ain't right in these woods lately. Coming from anyone else, I might have laughed it off, but Bill wasn't the type to spook easily. He'd seen mountain lions, dealt with aggressive bears, handled every kind of emergency the wilderness could throw at him. If something had him worried, it was worth paying attention to. The sun was already starting to set as I began my first round of checks. The air had that heavy feel to it that comes before a storm, thick and oppressive. The forecast had called for rain, but this felt different. The clouds hanging over the treeline were too dark, too still, like someone had painted them onto the sky. I made my way down to the old ranger station first. It was a decrepit thing, built back in the 60s when the park was first established. We mainly used it for storage now, keeping some emergency supplies and backup equipment there. The building had that particular smell that all abandoned places seem to share. A mixture of dust, mold, and decay that no amount of cleaning could quite eliminate. As I approached the station, I noticed something odd. The usual background noise of the forest, the constant chorus of birds, insects, and small animals, was starting to fade. At first it was so gradual I barely noticed it, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a radio. But by the time I reached the station's front door, the silence was absolute. In 6 years of working these woods, I'd never heard anything like it. Even during the worst storms, there was always some sound, wind in the trees, rain on the roof, something. This was different. This was wrong. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached for my radio thinking I should check in with dispatch when I felt it, a vibration so low at first I thought I was imagining it running through the soles of my boots. It reminded me of standing near train tracks as a freight train passes, that deep, bone-rattling rumble that you feel more than hear. But there weren't any trains anywhere near Wolf Creek Reserve. There wasn't anything that could make a sound like that, at least nothing that was supposed to be there. That's when I heard the first scream. The scream wasn't human. I want to be clear about that right up front. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard either, and in 6 years of working the park, I'd heard pretty much everything the local wildlife could produce. This was something else entirely, something that started as a high-pitched keening before dropping into a register so low it made my teeth ache. I pulled out my flashlight, though the sun hadn't completely set yet. The beam seemed weak, barely penetrating the strange twilight that had settled over the forest. The vibration was getting stronger now, and I could hear something else beneath it, a wet, sliding sound like something massive moving through the underbrush. My training told me to call it in, to wait for backup before investigating any unusual situation. But when I keyed the radio, all I got was static. Not the usual kind that comes from being out of range, but a strange, pulsing static that seemed to sync up with the vibrations running through the ground. The smart thing would have been to get back to my vehicle and leave. That's what any rational person would have done. But I'd spent too many years in these woods to just abandon them at the first sign of trouble. Plus, if there was something dangerous out there, I needed to know about it. We had campers in the park most nights, even if none were registered for that particular evening. I started moving toward Mirror Lake, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The silence in the forest was getting more oppressive with each step, like the trees themselves were leaning in, watching my progress. The air had gotten thicker too, almost soupy, and there was a smell I couldn't quite place, something ancient and organic, like the bottom of a long undisturbed pond. As I approached the lake, the fog started rolling in. Now, fog isn't unusual around water, especially in the evening, but this was different. It moved wrong, crawling across the ground in thick tendrils that seemed to reach out like fingers. The fog was dense enough that I had to slow down, careful not to lose my footing on the increasingly slick ground. That's when I saw the water start to move. Mirror Lake had always lived up to its name. The surface was usually so still it looked like glass, perfectly reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. But now the surface was rippling, though there wasn't a breath of wind. The ripples weren't moving outward from a central point either, like they would if something had disturbed the water. Instead, they were moving in spiral patterns as if the lake itself was slowly beginning to rotate. I'd reached the edge of the treeline now, standing maybe 30 feet from the water's edge. The vibrations had gotten strong enough that small pebbles were dancing on the ground, and the air felt electrically charged, like just before a lightning strike. The fog was thicker here, swirling around my legs in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I swept my flashlight beam across the water's surface, and that's when I caught the first glimpse of what was waiting in the lake. Just for a second, illuminated by the weak beam of my light, I saw something break the surface, something that looked like scales, but each one was the size of a dinner plate, glistening with an oily iridescence that made my eyes hurt to look at it. It disappeared almost instantly, sliding back beneath the water with barely a ripple. But that brief glimpse was enough to send my heart racing. Whatever I'd seen, it was big, much bigger than anything that should have been able to survive in a lake this size. I started backing away slowly, trying to keep my movements smooth and controlled. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but years of dealing with wildlife had taught me that running was usually the worst thing you could do. Predators chase what runs. That's when I heard it again, that impossible scream. But this time it was closer, much closer. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the trees and setting my teeth on edge. The water in the lake began to churn, no longer moving in neat spirals but thrashing violently, as if something massive was thrashing beneath the surface. I took another step back and my boot caught on something. A root or a stone, I'm still not sure. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree trunk, But in that moment of distraction, I lost sight of the water. When I looked back, the thing was already emerging. It rose from the lake like a mountain being born, water cascading off its massive form in sheets. In the growing darkness, I couldn't make out its full shape at first, just an impossibly large silhouette that kept rising and rising, blocking out what remained of the twilight sky. The beam of my flashlight caught it again, and this time I got a clear look at what we were dealing with. I wish to God I hadn't. The creature that emerged from Mirror Lake defied everything I thought I knew about biology, about what was possible in our world. Its head alone was larger than my truck, shaped like something between a snake and a crocodile, but wrong in ways that made my mind recoil. The scales I'd glimpsed earlier covered its entire body, each one shifting color like oil on water, creating patterns that seemed to move independently of the creature's movements. But it was the eyes that truly haunted me. They were huge, easily the size of car tires, and completely black. Not just dark, but the absence of light itself. Looking into them was like staring into the space between stars, a void so complete it seemed to pull at your sanity. And they were fixed directly on me. The creature's body continued to rise from the lake, water streaming off its form in torrents. It moved with an impossible grace for something of its size, its massive form flowing out of the water like liquid mercury. The low rumbling sound I'd been feeling through the ground was coming from it, a sound so deep it made my bones vibrate. I'd like to say I did something heroic at that moment, that I stood my ground or came up with some clever plan. But the truth is I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get away from those eyes, from that thing that shouldn't exist. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, the sound of trees snapping like twigs as it pursued me through the forest. The ground shook with each movement it made, and that terrible rumbling grew louder, mixing with a sound like steam escaping from a massive pressure valve. I ran until my lungs were burning, until spots danced in front of my eyes from lack of oxygen, but I couldn't stop. The old ranger station was somewhere ahead of me. I could barely make out its dark outline through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was the only shelter within reach. As I sprinted toward the station, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature was moving through the forest like a river of living metal, its massive body flowing between the trees with impossible fluidity. Where it touched the ground, the earth seemed to blacken and steam, as if its very presence was toxic to the natural world. I slammed into the station door with enough force to nearly take it off its hinges, scrambling inside and throwing the bolt, for whatever good that would do against something that size. The building's old walls suddenly seemed absurdly fragile, like a child's dollhouse facing down a bulldozer. Inside the station, I could hear the creature circling the building. The walls creaked and groaned as it brushed against them, testing their strength. I knew I had only moments before it found a way in. The gun locker was on the far wall, standard issue shotgun and ammunition locked inside. The keys were hanging by the door, but to reach them, I'd have to get dangerously close to the windows. That's when I noticed something else. The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly. I could see my breath misting in front of my face, and frost was beginning to form on the windows. The creature's proximity seemed to be affecting the very air around it, pulling the heat out of everything it came near. I had to make a choice, stay where I was and hope the building would somehow protect me, or make a dash for the gun locker and at least have a fighting chance. The decision was made for me when the wall to my left suddenly bulged inward, wood splintering as something massive pressed against it. I dove for the keys, snatched them off their hook and scrambled toward the locker. Behind me, I heard the wall finally give way with a deafening crack. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it that overwhelming smell of ancient things and decay. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, could practically sense those void-like eyes fixed on my back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the locker's lock. I could hear the creature moving inside the station now, its massive body somehow flowing through an opening that should have been too small for it. The temperature had dropped so low that my fingers were going numb, making it even harder to work the lock. Finally, the lock clicked open. I grabbed the shotgun and a handful of shells, turned, and found myself face to face with a nightmare. The creature had gotten its head and part of its body into the station, and in the confined space, it seemed even larger than before. Its scales were constantly shifting color now, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. The air around it wavered like a heat mirage, except instead of heat, it was radiating intense cold. I loaded the shotgun with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, chambered around, and fired directly at the creature's head. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, but what happened next was even more shocking. Where the buckshot hit, the creature's scales seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like water before settling back into place. The creature reacted, though, rearing back with a screech that shattered every window in the station. I used that moment to slam more shells into the gun, but I knew I was running out of options. The cold was getting worse and I could feel my movements becoming sluggish. That's when I noticed something. Where the creature had touched the walls and floor, there were marks. Not just physical damage, but something else. The wood looked aged, decades of decay happening in minutes. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just physically dangerous, it was somehow affecting time itself around it. I fired again, this time aiming for one of those massive eyes. The shot went wide, but it gave me an idea. The creature might be armored, but surely it had vulnerable spots. I just had to find them. The thing lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping at the space where I'd been standing moments before. I rolled to the side, coming up against the old wooden desk that had been pushed into a corner. The movement brought me closer to the creature than I'd wanted to be, and I could see details I wish I hadn't, like the way its scales seemed to move independently of each other, or how there were smaller, darker shapes moving beneath its semi-transparent skin. I fired again, this time hitting the softer area under its jaw. The creature recoiled, and for the first time I saw something that looked like actual damage, a dark fluid that might have been blood seeping from between its scales. But my small victory was short-lived. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. It thrashed, bringing down half the station's roof in the process. I barely managed to dodge a falling beam, but the movement put me in a corner. I was trapped. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on my clothes. My movements were becoming more difficult, and I knew I couldn't last much longer in this cold. The creature seemed to sense my weakening, taking its time now as it moved toward me, those black eyes fixed on my face. That's when I saw it, the old emergency flare gun, still mounted on the wall behind me. It was ancient, probably hadn't been checked in years, but it was my only option left. I grabbed it, praying it would still work. The creature lunged again, and I fired the flare directly into its open mouth. For a split second, nothing happened and my heart sank. Then the flare ignited. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature's entire head lit up from within, its semi-transparent flesh glowing an awful, sickly red. It reared back with a shriek that threatened to burst my eardrums, thrashing wildly in the confined space of the station. Where the flare's light touched its flesh, the creature's scales began to bubble and melt, revealing something underneath that looked less like flesh and more like living darkness. I didn't waste the opportunity. I reloaded the shotgun and started firing systematically at the areas the flare had weakened. Each shot tore away more of the creature's outer layer, revealing more of that impossible darkness beneath. The cold was intense now, far beyond anything natural. My fingers were turning blue, and each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. But the creature was weakening. Its movements became more erratic, less fluid. The darkness beneath its scales seemed to be leaking out like smoke, dissipating in the frigid air. With each shot, more of it seemed to lose cohesion. Parts of its massive body literally evaporated into the air. Then something happened that I still can't properly explain. As the creature thrashed in its death throes, reality itself seemed to warp around it. The air buckled and twisted, and for a brief moment, I saw something else through the holes I'd blown in its flesh. I caught glimpses of what looked like another place entirely, A vast, dark space filled with shapes that moved in ways that shouldn't be possible. The creature made one final, desperate lunge at me. I emptied the last of my shells into its head and suddenly everything stopped. The cold, the otherworldly glimpses, even the sound, it all just ceased. The creature's massive body collapsed, partially inside the station and partially out, already beginning to dissolve into a thick, dark liquid that steamed in the night air. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to move again, to regenerate, to do something. But it just continued to dissolve, leaving behind nothing but a dark stain on the wood and a lingering smell of ozone and decay. The authorities arrived just before dawn. I'd managed to get the radio working again after the creature died, though the signal was still weak and full of strange interference. I don't think they really believed me at first. Who would? But when they saw the devastation at the ranger station, the massive track marks in the earth, and the dark stains that seemed to be eating into the wood wherever the creature had touched, they had to accept that something had happened. The next few days were a blur of interviews, reports, and medical examinations. They found traces of severe frostbite on my extremities, though I hadn't even noticed in the adrenaline of the moment. The doctors couldn't explain how I'd developed such severe cold damage on a warm summer night. The government sent in a team of specialists, they never said from which agency, who spent weeks studying the site. They took samples of everything, the stained wood, the soil, even core samples from the trees near where the creature had passed. They drained Mirror Lake completely, though they never said what, if anything, they found at the bottom. What bothered me most was what they didn't find. There should have been a body, or at least remains of some kind. Something that big doesn't just disappear without a trace. But by the time the authorities arrived, all that was left were those strange stains and the damage to the forest. Even those began to fade after a few weeks, like the land itself was trying to forget what had happened. The park was officially closed for environmental assessment. They strung up chain-link fences and posted armed guards. Last I heard, they're still there, though no one seems to know exactly what they're guarding against. In the months that followed, I spent a lot of time trying to make sense of what had happened. I researched cryptozoology, folklore, even quantum physics, anything that might explain what I'd seen. I found plenty of stories about lake monsters and forest creatures, but nothing that quite matched what I'd encountered. The closest I came to an answer was in some old local histories I found in the county library. Turns out the Native Americans who originally lived in the area had stories about a place in the forest they called the Thin Space, where the boundary between our world and somewhere else was weak. They avoided the area entirely, especially during certain times of the year when the barrier was supposedly at its thinnest. The location they described matched almost exactly with where Mirror Lake now sits. The lake itself isn't natural. It was created in the 1960s when they dammed up part of Wolf Creek to create a reservoir. I can't help but wonder if maybe they disturbed something that should have been left alone. I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that night, especially about those glimpses I caught through the creature's wounded flesh. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those impossible geometries, that sense of something vast and ancient looking back at me through those void-like eyes. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. The physical effects were easy enough to deal with. The frostbite healed, though my fingers still ache when the weather turns cold. But the psychological impact, that's been harder to shake. I can't look at large bodies of water anymore without feeling a creeping dread. The sight of fog rolling in sets my heart racing. Even normal, everyday sounds, like the rumble of distant thunder or the vibration of a passing truck, can send me right back to that night. But the worst part is the dreams. They started a few weeks after the incident and haven't really stopped. In them, I'm back at Mirror Lake, but everything is wrong. The water flows upward, the trees grow in impossible angles, and that thing is always there watching me with those black empty eyes. Sometimes I think I understand what it's trying to tell me, but I always wake up before I can grasp it fully. The doctors call it PTSD, prescribe medications and therapy. They mean well, but how do you process something that shouldn't be possible? How do you move on when you've seen proof that everything you thought you knew about reality is wrong? These days I live up near the Canadian border, in a small cabin surrounded by pine forests. It's peaceful here most of the time. The locals are friendly but keep to themselves, which suits me just fine. I took a job as a fire lookout, plenty of solitude but far from any large bodies of water. I still get letters sometimes from researchers, cryptozoologists, and conspiracy theorists who've heard about what happened at Wolf Creek. They all want interviews, details, proof. I don't respond anymore. What would I tell them? That there are things in this world that don't fit into any of our neat little categories? That sometimes the line between what's possible and what isn't is thinner than we think? The government keeps sending me checks, consultation fees they call them, though I haven't consulted on anything. I think it's hush money, but I would have kept quiet anyway. Who'd believe me? Sometimes, on particularly clear nights, I sit on my cabin's porch and look up at the stars. They don't comfort me like they used to. Now when I look at that vast darkness between the stars, I can't help but wonder if something is looking back. I think about those glimpses I caught through the creature's wounded flesh, about that other place I saw. I've come to believe that what I encountered wasn't just some undiscovered species or mutated creature. It was something else entirely, maybe a visitor from somewhere beyond our understanding, or maybe something that's always been here, hiding in the dark places of our world. Either way, I know one thing for certain. That night at Wolf Creek wasn't an ending. It was just the first sign of something bigger, something that's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the shadows grow long, I swear I can still hear that deep, rumbling sound coming from somewhere far away, but getting closer. I keep the shotgun loaded these days, though I know it probably won't do much good if something like that ever shows up again. But it helps me sleep at night knowing it's there. That's about all any of us can do, really. Keep our weapons close, stay away from dark water, and hope that whatever lies beyond that thin space between worlds decides to stay on its side of the divide. But deep down, I know better. Whatever that thing was, wherever it came from, it was just the beginning. There are more out there, and sooner or later they'll find their way through. I was never much of a camper, growing up in Manhattan where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional rat scurrying across the subway tracks. I developed an almost instinctive aversion to anything that couldn't be reached by public transportation. The city was my sanctuary, a concrete jungle where every corner held something familiar. The smell of street vendor hot dogs, the endless symphony of car horns, the warm glow of street lights that never quite let the darkness settle in. My brother Felix was different. While I found comfort in the predictable chaos of urban life, he seemed to draw energy from its absence. Born just 15 months after me, we shared the same dark hair and sharp features inherited from our mother, but that's where the similarities ended. Where I was tense and calculating, Felix moved through life with an easy grace, as if he'd somehow learned the secret to staying calm in a world that never stopped moving. We grew up in a fifth-floor walk-up in the Lower East Side, where money was always tight but love wasn't. Our parents worked double shifts to keep us fed and clothed. Mom as a nurse at Beth Israel, Dad doing whatever odd jobs he could find between his regular gig as a superintendent. Felix and I shared a bedroom until I was 17, a cramped space where we'd lie awake at night talking about everything and nothing. Even then, the differences between us were clear. I talk about my dreams of becoming a financial analyst, of making enough money to buy Mom and Dad a proper house. Felix would describe the mountains he'd seen in magazines, the forests he wanted to explore, the silence he craved. I never understood it, but I loved him for it. He was my little brother, and his dreams, however foreign they seemed to me, were as valid as my own. By 1997, we'd both managed to carve out our own paths. I had my entry-level position at a mid-sized investment firm, complete with a tiny studio apartment in Murray Hill that cost more than it should. Felix had taken a different route, working as an outdoor equipment specialist at REI, spending his weekends leading hiking groups through the Catskills and his vacation days exploring increasingly remote locations. When he called me that spring evening, his voice crackling with excitement over my landline, I knew he wanted something. "Ivan," he said, not bothering with a greeting, "I found this place in Montana. It's called Needle Creek, and it's absolutely perfect. Pristine wilderness, barely any human traffic, and the most incredible rock formations you've ever seen." I leaned back in my desk chair, already knowing where this was heading. "Felix, just hear me out," he interrupted. "I've got all the gear we need, 2 weeks of vacation time saved up. It'll be like when we were kids, just the two of us. When's the last time we did something together? Really together?" He had me there. Between my 60-hour work weeks and his endless outdoor excursions, we'd barely seen each other in months. The guilt must have shown in my silence because he pressed on. "Look, I know it's not your thing, but I've done all the research. The weather will be perfect this time of year, and I've got maps, supplies, everything we need. I even got those fancy freeze-dried meals you liked when we went to the Adirondacks." I remembered that trip, my first and only camping experience until then. It had been a disaster by any objective measure, with rain that wouldn't stop and mosquitoes that seemed to find me regardless of how much repellent I used. But I also remembered Felix's patience, how he taught me to start a fire even with wet wood, how we'd stayed up late sharing stories and a flask of whiskey. "When?" I asked, already knowing I'd regret this. 2 weeks from Saturday," he replied, trying and failing to hide the triumph in his voice. "I'll pick you up at 6 in the morning sharp." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You know I'm going to hate every minute of this, right?" He laughed, that warm, genuine sound that always made everything seem a little less serious. "Maybe. But you'll remember it forever. Trust me on this one, big brother." If I'd known then what I know now, I would have said no. I would have made up an excuse. Work emergency, sudden illness, anything to stay in my safe, predictable city life. But I didn't know, and neither did Felix. So I said yes, and that decision would change everything. Felix's Toyota Corolla looked like it had survived several wars, most of them poorly. The once red paint had faded to a patchy pink, and rust had claimed significant territory along the wheel wells. But according to Felix, it was trail-tested, whatever that meant. He'd picked me up exactly at 6, true to his word, and we'd been on the road for hours, watching the urban sprawl of the East Coast gradually give way to increasingly rural landscapes. "You know," Felix said, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as we crossed into Montana, "there's something special about this place. The locals don't talk about it much, but there's history here. Old history." I was half listening, more focused on the way the car seemed to shake whenever we hit speeds above 60. "What kind of history?" "Native American legends mostly. The Blackfeet called this area the place where shadows walk. They avoided it, especially at night. There are stories about people going missing, about sounds that couldn't be explained." I shot him a look. "You're not helping your case here." He grinned, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. "I'm not trying to scare you. I just think it's fascinating, all these stories passed down through generations, and nobody really knows what's true and what isn't." The highway had given way to smaller roads, then to gravel, and finally to what could generously be called a trail. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a tunnel effect that made me feel increasingly claustrophobic. The car bounced and rattled over every bump, and I found myself gripping the door handle with white-knuckled intensity. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "Another hour, maybe less," Felix replied, his eyes scanning the rough path ahead. "The trailhead's not marked on most maps. I found it through some hiking forums. People say it's one of the most pristine areas left in the state." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak as we navigated another particularly rough patch. The forest seemed to grow denser with each passing mile, the trees older and more gnarled. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. We finally reached the trailhead just as the sun was beginning to set. It was marked by a simple wooden sign, weather-beaten and barely legible, "Needle Creek Trail." Below it, someone had carved something in smaller letters, but time and elements had rendered it unreadable. Felix parked the car in a small clearing, killing the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. No traffic noise, no human sounds at all, just the whisper of wind through trees and the distant sound of running water. "Home sweet home," Felix said, climbing out of the car and stretching. "At least for the next few days." I followed, less enthusiastically, and helped unload our gear. Felix had packed everything with military precision: tents, sleeping bags, food, water filters, first aid supplies, and 2 old hunting rifles that looked like they'd seen better days. "Are those really necessary?" I asked, eyeing the weapons. "Probably not," Felix shrugged, checking the chambers with practiced ease. "But Dad always said it's better to have them and not need them than the other way around. Besides, there are bears in these parts. Mountain lions too." The mention of predators didn't help my growing unease, but I tried to focus on the practical aspects of our situation. Felix showed me how to properly adjust my backpack, making sure the weight was distributed evenly. As I watched him work, I was struck by how different he seemed out here. In the city, he always looked slightly out of place, like a wild animal in captivity. But here, among the trees and silence, he moved with absolute confidence. "Ready?" he asked, shouldering his own pack. I took one last look at the car, our last connection to civilization. "As I'll ever be." Felix checked his compass, oriented himself with the rough map he'd brought, and started down the trail. I followed, trying to ignore the feeling that the forest was watching us, that each step took us further from the world I understood and deeper into something else entirely. The sound of Needle Creek grew louder as we walked, though we couldn't see it yet through the dense undergrowth. The trail itself was barely visible in places, more suggested than defined. Felix moved surely ahead of me, occasionally pointing out different plants or animal tracks that meant nothing to my city-trained eyes. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold something waiting to emerge. But Felix kept moving forward and I followed because that's what I'd always done. I was never much of a camper, growing up in Manhattan where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional rat scurrying across the subway tracks. I developed an almost instinctive aversion to anything that couldn't be reached by public transportation. The city was my sanctuary, a concrete jungle where every corner held something familiar: the smell of street vendor hot dogs, the endless symphony of car horns, the warm glow of street lights that never quite let the darkness settle in. My brother Felix was different. While I found comfort in the predictable chaos of urban life, he seemed to draw energy from its absence. Born just 15 months after me, we shared the same dark hair and sharp features inherited from our mother, but that's where the similarities ended. Where I was tense and calculating, Felix moved through life with an easy grace, as if he'd somehow learned the secret to staying calm in a world that never stopped moving. We grew up in a 5th-floor walk-up in the Lower East Side, where money was always tight but love wasn't. Our parents worked double shifts to keep us fed and clothed. Mom as a nurse at Beth Israel, Dad doing whatever odd jobs he could find between his regular gig as a superintendent. Felix and I shared a bedroom until I was 17, a cramped space where we'd lie awake at night talking about everything and nothing. Even then, the differences between us were clear. I talk about my dreams of becoming a financial analyst, of making enough money to buy Mom and Dad a proper house. Felix would describe the mountains he'd seen in magazines, the forests he wanted to explore, the silence he craved. I never understood it, but I loved him for it. He was my little brother, and his dreams, however foreign they seemed to me, were as valid as my own. By 1997, we'd both managed to carve out our own paths. I had my entry-level position at a mid-sized investment firm, complete with a tiny studio apartment in Murray Hill that cost more than it should. Felix had taken a different route, working as an outdoor equipment specialist at REI, spending his weekends leading hiking groups through the Catskills and his vacation days exploring increasingly remote locations. When he called me that spring evening, his voice crackling with excitement over my landline. I knew he wanted something. "Ivan," he said, not bothering with a greeting, "I found this place in Montana. It's called Needle Creek, and it's absolutely perfect. Pristine wilderness, barely any human traffic, and the most incredible rock formations you've ever seen." I leaned back in my desk chair, already knowing where this was heading. "Felix, just hear me out," he interrupted. "I've got all the gear we need, 2 weeks of vacation time saved up. It'll be like when we were kids. Just the two of us. When's the last time we did something together? Really together?" He had me there. Between my 60-hour work weeks and his endless outdoor excursions, we'd barely seen each other in months. The guilt must have shown in my silence because he pressed on. "Look, I know it's not your thing, but I've done all the research. The weather will be perfect this time of year, and I've got maps, supplies, everything we need. I even got those fancy freeze-dried meals you liked when we went to the Adirondacks." I remembered that trip, my first and only camping experience until then. It had been a disaster by any objective measure, with rain that wouldn't stop and mosquitoes that seemed to find me regardless of how much repellent I used. But I also remembered Felix's patience, how he'd taught me to start a fire even with wet wood, how we'd stayed up late sharing stories and a flask of whiskey. "When?" I asked, already knowing I'd regret this. 2 weeks from Saturday," he replied, trying and failing to hide the triumph in his voice. "I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock in the morning sharp." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You know I'm going to hate every minute of this, right?" He laughed, that warm, genuine sound that always made everything seem a little less serious. "Maybe, but you'll remember it forever. Trust me on this one, big brother." If I'd known then what I know now, I would have said no. I would have made up an excuse. Work emergency, sudden illness, anything to stay in my safe, predictable city life. But I didn't know, and neither did Felix, so I said yes, and that decision would change everything. Felix's Toyota Corolla looked like it had survived several wars, most of them poorly. The once red paint had faded to a patchy pink, and rust had claimed significant territory along the wheel wells. But according to Felix, it was trail-tested, whatever that meant. He'd picked me up exactly at 6, true to his word, and we'd been on the road for hours, watching the urban sprawl of the East Coast gradually give way to increasingly rural landscapes. "You know, Felix," I said, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel as we crossed into Montana, "there's something special about this place. The locals don't talk about it much, but there's history here. Old history." I was half listening, more focused on the way the car seemed to shake whenever we hit speeds above 60. "What kind of history?" "Native American legends, mostly. The Blackfeet called this area the place where shadows walk. They avoided it, especially at night. There are stories about people going missing, about sounds that couldn't be explained." I shot him a look. "You're not helping your case here." He grinned, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. "I'm not trying to scare you. I just think it's fascinating, all these stories passed down through generations, and nobody really knows what's true and what isn't." The highway had given way to smaller roads, then to gravel, and finally to what could generously be called a trail. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a tunnel effect that made me feel increasingly claustrophobic. The car bounced and rattled over every bump, and I found myself gripping the door handle with white-knuckled intensity. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "Another hour, maybe less," Felix replied, his eyes scanning the rough path ahead. "The trailhead's not marked on most maps. I found it through some hiking forums. People say it's one of the most pristine areas left in the state." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak as we navigated another particularly rough patch. The forest seemed to grow denser with each passing mile, the trees older and more gnarled. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. We finally reached the trailhead just as the sun was beginning to set. It was marked by a simple wooden sign, weather-beaten and barely legible, Needle Creek Trail. Below it, someone had carved something in smaller letters, but time and elements had rendered it unreadable. Felix parked the car in a small clearing, killing the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. No traffic noise, no human sounds at all, just the whisper of wind through trees and the distant sound of running water. "Home sweet home," Felix said, climbing out of the car and stretching. "At least for the next few days." I followed, less enthusiastically, and helped unload our gear. Felix had packed everything with military precision: tents, sleeping bags, food, water filters, first aid supplies, and 2 old hunting rifles that looked like they'd seen better days. "Are those really necessary?" I asked, eyeing the weapons warily. Felix shrugged, checking the chambers with practiced ease. "Probably not, but Dad always said it's better to have them and not need them than the other way around. Besides, there are bears in these parts. Mountain lions too." The mention of predators didn't help my growing unease, but I tried to focus on the practical aspects of our situation. Felix showed me how to properly adjust my backpack, making sure the weight was distributed evenly. As I watched him work, I was struck by how different he seemed out here. In the city, he always looked slightly out of place, like a wild animal in captivity. But here, among the trees and silence, he moved with absolute confidence. "Ready?" he asked, shouldering his own pack. I took one last look at the car, our last connection to civilization. "As I'll ever be." Felix checked his compass, oriented himself with the rough map he'd brought, and started down the trail. I followed, trying to ignore the feeling that the forest was watching us, that each step took us further from the world I understood and deeper into something else entirely. The sound of Needle Creek grew louder as we walked, though we couldn't see it yet through the dense undergrowth. The trail itself was barely visible in places, more suggested than defined. Felix moved surely ahead of me, occasionally pointing out different plants or animal tracks that meant nothing to my city-trained eyes. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold something waiting to emerge. But Felix kept moving forward, and I followed because that's what I'd always done. By the time we found a suitable camping spot, the sun was low in the sky, painting the forest in shades of amber and deep shadow. Felix had chosen a small clearing near the creek, where the ground was relatively flat and the water ran clear over rocks that did indeed seem to rise like needles from the riverbed. "This is perfect," Felix said, dropping his pack and surveying the area with obvious satisfaction. "Good sight lines, close to water, and the ground's dry enough for comfortable sleeping." I was less enthusiastic, noting how the surrounding trees seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater that made me feel exposed rather than protected. But I kept my concerns to myself, focusing instead on helping Felix set up camp. We worked efficiently, Felix directing and me following his lead. The tents went up without too much trouble. Modern designs that were mercifully simpler than the complicated structures I remembered from our childhood camping trips. Felix showed me how to properly store our food, hanging it from a high branch to keep it away from curious wildlife. As darkness began to settle in, Felix got a fire going. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, and for a moment I could almost understand what drew him to places like this. The silence wasn't complete. There was the constant murmur of the creek, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of some night bird, but it was different from the city's endless noise. It was more intentional somehow. "Hungry?" Felix asked, already pulling supplies from his pack. He'd brought a small camping stove but insisted on cooking over the open fire. "Nothing tastes better than bacon and beans in the wilderness," he declared, setting up a small grill over the flames. I watched him work, noting how at ease he seemed. "You really love this, don't you? Being out here, away from everything." He nodded, stirring the beans thoughtfully. "It's like, in the city everything's artificial. The lights, the sounds, even the air we breathe. Out here everything's real raw. When you strip away all the distractions, you can finally hear yourself think." I think too much already, I muttered, but there was no bite in it. The food smelled good, and despite my reservations about this whole adventure, I found myself relaxing slightly. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only siblings can share. The beans were better than they had any right to be, and the bacon was perfect. After dinner, Felix pulled out a flask of whiskey, the same brand we'd shared on our Adirondack trip. For old time's sake, he said, passing it to me. I took a sip, feeling the familiar burn. Remember how Dad used to take us fishing? Not camping, just day trips to that little lake upstate. Felix laughed. Yeah, we never caught anything worth keeping, but he was so patient. Always said it wasn't about the fish anyway. He would have loved this place. I said softly, yeah, he would have. Our father had passed away 2 years earlier, a heart attack that no one saw coming. The loss had hit Felix particularly hard. They'd shared that love of the outdoors, that need to escape the city's confines. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Above us, stars were beginning to appear, more than I'd ever seen in the city. The Milky Way was visible, a river of light across the black velvet of the sky. Beautiful, isn't it? Felix said, following my gaze. You can't see this in Manhattan. Too much light pollution. I had to admit he was right. It was beautiful in a way that made me feel small and insignificant. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put into words. The darkness between the stars seemed deeper out here, more absolute. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped significantly. We added more wood to the fire, but the cold seemed to creep in from all sides. The forest had grown quieter, the ambient sounds dropping away until all we could hear was the creak and the pop and crack of burning wood. We should get some sleep, Felix said eventually, checking his watch. We've got a long hike tomorrow if we want to reach the upper valley. I nodded, though the idea of sleeping out here with only a thin layer of nylon between me and whatever lurked in the darkness wasn't particularly appealing. Felix must have sensed my unease. Don't worry, he said gently, punching my shoulder. I've done this hundreds of times. Nothing out here is interested in us. If only he'd been right. Sleep didn't come easily. Despite the exhaustion from the day's hike, I found myself lying awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. Felix had insisted we set up separate tents, something about developing self-reliance in the wilderness, and I was beginning to regret agreeing to that arrangement. The darkness was absolute, different from the city's artificial night. Even with my eyes fully adjusted, I could barely see the outline of my hand in front of my face. The sounds were different too. In Manhattan, there was always some ambient noise, traffic, distant sirens, the hum of air conditioners. Here, every sound stood out with startling clarity. The rush of the creek, the whisper of wind through trees, the occasional snap of a twig that made my heart race. I must have dozed off eventually because I remember dreaming. I was back in our old apartment, standing in the kitchen while Mom made breakfast. But something was wrong. The windows were dark, impossibly dark, and when Mom turned around, her face was obscured by shadows that shouldn't have been there. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was, and the panic was overwhelming. Then reality settled back in, the tent, the sleeping bag, Needle Creek. But something had woken me, something beyond the natural transition from dream to wakefulness. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The night had changed. The usual forest sounds had gone quiet, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling sound like distant thunder, but somehow wrong. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. Felix. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't thunder, it was too sustained, too deliberate. It reminded me of the subway trains passing beneath the city streets, but deeper, more primal. And there was something else in it, something that spoke to a part of my brain I didn't usually acknowledge, the part that remembered when humans were prey. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the darkness outside the tent. I could see Felix's tent just a few yards away, still and silent. "Felix," I called again, louder this time. I saw movement in his tent, then heard the rustle of his sleeping bag. "Ivan?" His voice was thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Listen," I whispered. For a moment there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. I began to wonder if I'd imagined it all, if the unfamiliar environment was playing tricks on my mind. Then it came again, and this time I heard Felix's sharp intake of breath. The sound was closer now, close enough that I could feel it in my chest. A vibration that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly with my bones. Felix unzipped his tent, and I saw the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Get the rifles," he said, his voice tense but controlled. "Slowly. Don't make any sudden movements." I crawled out of my tent, moving as quietly as possible. The cold night air bit at my exposed skin as I fumbled with the rifle. Felix was already in motion, his movements precise and controlled despite the fear I could sense radiating from him. The rumbling sound grew closer, seeming to come from all directions at once. Our fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to make the shadows deeper, more threatening. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, creating shifting shapes that played tricks on our eyes. "Stay close," Felix whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. "Whatever happens, don't run unless I say so." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he could see it. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind in the trees, no creek sounds, no nocturnal animals. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then we saw it. The creature emerged from between two ancient pines, moving with an impossible fluidity that defied natural law. In the dim light, its form seemed to shift and change, but certain details burned themselves into my memory. Limbs too long and thin to support any known creature, joints that bent in ways that made my stomach turn, and a head that seemed more like a nightmare's interpretation of a skull than anything that belonged in our world. Felix fired first, the crack of the rifle shattering the unnatural silence. The creature didn't flinch. It turned its head toward us with a terrible slowness, and I felt its gaze like ice water in my veins. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were deep, empty pits that seemed to pull at something inside me. I fired next, my hand shaking so badly I'm surprised I could pull the trigger at all. The bullet seemed to pass through it as if it were made of smoke, but the trees behind it splintered from the impacts. The creature opened its mouth, a gash that split its head nearly in half, and released a sound that made my knees buckle. It was like every nightmare I'd ever had given voice, a sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primitive part of my brain that remembered when humans were prey. "Run!" Felix screamed, grabbing my arm and yanking me into motion. We crashed through the underbrush, blind panic driving us forward. I could hear it behind us, moving with a speed that nothing that size should possess. The sound of its pursuit was wrong, not the crash of vegetation or the thud of footfalls, but a smooth, continuous rushing noise like wind through a tunnel. Felix led the way, somehow maintaining his sense of direction even in the chaos. I followed, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The creature was getting closer. I could feel its presence behind me, a cold pressure that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought we couldn't run another step, Felix spotted the cave. It was little more than a crack in a rocky outcropping, barely visible in the darkness. We dove inside, pressing ourselves against the cold stone walls. The opening was too small for the creature to follow. At least that's what we hoped. We heard it outside moving around the entrance. The sound it made was different now, a low rhythmic pulsing that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It stayed there for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that small dark space. Eventually the sounds faded. We stayed in the cave until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, neither of us willing to risk leaving our shelter in the darkness. The morning light revealed the true extent of what had happened. The ground where the creature had moved was changed, not just disturbed but fundamentally altered. The earth was scorched in a pattern that followed its path, and the vegetation had withered and blackened, as if it had been exposed to intense cold rather than heat. Our campsite was destroyed. The tents were shredded, our supplies scattered. The trees around the clearing bore deep gouges that no natural animal could have made. But it was the smell that hit me hardest. A sharp, metallic odor that reminded me of ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something older and more primitive. Felix moved through the wreckage methodically, gathering what supplies he could salvage. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. He nodded, but something in his expression made me uneasy. There was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and fascination that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you see how it moved?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "It wasn't natural. Nothing about it was natural." "Felix," I said sharply, "we need to go." He seemed to shake himself out of whatever trance he'd fallen into. Yeah, you're right." We gathered what we could carry and started the long trek back to the car. The forest felt different in daylight, but not in a reassuring way. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, the silence more complete. Even the creek's sound seemed muted, as if the water itself was trying to avoid drawing attention. The journey back to civilization was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every snapped twig made us jump, every shadow held potential horrors. Felix drove mechanically, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while I kept watching the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. The transition back to the familiar world of highways and gas stations felt surreal. How could everything look so normal, so unchanged, when we'd experienced something that defied reality itself? The fluorescent lights of a roadside diner where we stopped for coffee seemed harsh and artificial, but I welcomed their unnatural glow. At least they were human-made, comprehensible. We barely spoke during the drive. What was there to say? Any attempt to put our experience into words seemed inadequate, almost disrespectful to the sheer otherworldliness of what we'd witnessed. But I could see the wheels turning in Felix's mind, could sense him trying to make sense of it all. When he finally dropped me off at my apartment in Manhattan, the city felt both familiar and strange, like a photograph that's slightly out of focus. The constant noise and light that had once irritated me now felt comforting, a shield against the darkness we'd encountered. "Take care of yourself, Ivan," Felix said as I got out of the car. His voice was different, older somehow, weighted with knowledge we were never meant to have. "You too," I replied, knowing even then that something fundamental had changed between us. As I watched his tail lights disappear into the night traffic, I had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the end of it. Felix called me 3 months later. His voice was excited, almost feverish, as he told me about another location he'd found, even more remote than Needle Creek. "There are patterns, Ivan," he said, speaking quickly. "Places where the boundaries are thin, where things can cross over. I've been researching, talking to people who've had similar experiences. We're not the only ones who've seen it." "Felix, please," I begged. "Let it go. Whatever it was, whatever we saw, we were lucky to survive. But don't you see? That's exactly why we can't ignore it. People need to know. They need to understand what's out there." I tried to talk him out of it, but I knew it was useless. Felix had always been stubborn, and now he had a purpose, an obsession that I could hear burning in every word. 2 weeks later, I got the call from the Rangers. They'd found his campsite in the Bitterroot Mountains, tents still standing, gear laid out neatly, fire pit cold but recently used. But Felix was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just emptiness where my brother should have been. The search lasted for weeks. I flew out to Montana, joined the rescue teams, combed through miles of wilderness. But deep down, I knew we wouldn't find him. Whatever had taken him, Whether it was the same thing we'd encountered at Needle Creek or something equally unknowable, it hadn't left anything for us to find. I couldn't stay in New York after that. The city that had once been my sanctuary now felt confining, artificial. I moved to a small town in Colorado, where the mountains loom on the horizon and the stars are visible at night. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. I've learned my lesson about that. But sometimes on clear nights I sit on my porch and look up at the vast expanse of sky. And sometimes when the wind is right, I hear something in the distance. A low, resonant sound that makes my bones ache with remembered fear. When that happens, I think about Felix, about whatever drove him back into the darkness. Was it curiosity? Obsession? Or did something call to him, pulling him back like a fish on a line? I'll never know for sure, but I've made my peace with that. More or less. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, places we're not meant to go. Felix found one of those places, and it consumed him just as it almost consumed me. So I stay in my small town, living a quiet life, and I try not to think too much about what might be out there in the darkness. But sometimes late at night, I dream of Needle Creek, of shadows that move wrong and sounds that shouldn't exist. And in those dreams, I see Felix walking deeper into the forest, following something that I can never quite see. And I wake up knowing that whatever took my brother is still out there, still hunting, still waiting in the places where the shadows are deepest and the silence speaks volumes. But it's not my fight anymore. I've learned to live with the knowledge that some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved. Because sometimes the price of understanding is too high to pay. The construction site's familiar chaos faded behind me as I pulled out of Charlotte, my old Winnebago groaning under the weight of a week's worth of supplies. The open road stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt promising escape from the memories that haunted every corner of the empty house I once shared with Clara. My name's Quinn O'Brien, and at 53, I'd spent more than half my life pouring concrete and raising steel frames into the sky. 15 years as a construction supervisor had left its mark, calloused hands, a perpetual squint from years under the sun, and a spine that protested a little more each season. But it was honest work, the kind that let a man sleep at night knowing he'd left something tangible behind. Claire. God, I miss her. 2 years gone, taken by a cancer that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. Some days the grief still hits like a sucker punch, leaving me winded and lost. That's why I found myself on this impromptu fishing trip, seeking solace in the promise of still waters and the methodical rhythm of casting a line. The idea had come from Mike, my foreman, and the closest thing I had to a friend these days. Quinn, he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder after a particularly rough day on site, you need to get out of your head for a while. I know a spot down in the Appalachians near Fontana Lake. It's so quiet you can hear your own thoughts echo. At first I'd brushed him off. The outdoors had always been Clara's thing, not mine. But as the weeks wore on and the walls of my house seemed to close in, the idea took root. Maybe what I needed was a total change of scenery, somewhere I couldn't see her ghost around every corner. So here I was, racing the setting sun as I wound my way through the foothills of western North Carolina. The roads grew narrower, the town sparser, until finally I found myself on a dirt track barely wide enough for the RV. The GPS had given up miles ago, leaving me to navigate by Mike's hand-drawn map and my own questionable sense of direction. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, I caught my first glimpse of Fontana Lake. The water stretched out before me, a mirror reflecting the fiery sky above. The stillness was almost oppressive after months of city noise. No distant sirens, no hum of traffic, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I maneuvered the Winnebago into a small clearing not far from the shore, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out, the rich scent of damp earth and pine filled my lungs. For the first time in months, I felt the knot in my chest loosen just a fraction. Setting up camp was a welcome distraction. I busied myself with leveling the RV, unfolding the awning and arranging my fishing gear. By the time I had a small fire crackling in the pit, night had fully fallen. The stars emerged one by one, more than I'd seen in years, until the sky was awash with pinpricks of light. Sitting by the fire, a beer in hand, I found myself talking to Clara as if she were there beside me. "You'd love this place, hun," I murmured, my voice barely audible above the pop and crackle of burning wood. "Maybe you're out there somewhere, seeing it through my eyes." The thought brought a bittersweet smile to my lips. I wasn't a religious man, but the idea that some part of her might still exist, watching over me, was a comfort I clung to on my darkest days. As the fire burned down to embers, exhaustion from the long drive finally caught up with me. I doused the flames, secured the site against any curious wildlife, and retreated to the familiar confines of the Winnebago. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep. I woke to birdsong and shafts of early morning sunlight streaming through the RV's windows. For a moment, disoriented, I reached for Clara before reality reasserted itself. The pang of loss was familiar now, a dull ache rather than the sharp agony of those first few months. Shaking off the melancholy, I set about making a simple breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal. As I ate, I planned out my day, fishing in the morning, maybe a short hike in the afternoon to explore the surrounding forest. It was a far cry from the regimented schedule of the construction site, but that was the point, wasn't it? To break away from routine, to find some peace in the solitude. Little did I know, as I rigged up my fishing rod and selected a lure, that peace would be the last thing I'd find in these woods. The horrors that awaited me, both natural and unnatural, would push me to the very limits of my endurance and sanity. But in that moment, ignorant of what was to come, I breathed in the crisp morning air and felt, for the first time in too long, a spark of hope. The first day passed uneventfully, almost idyllically. I spent the morning on the lake, my small john boat drifting lazily with the current. The fishing was good. I caught several decent-sized smallmouth bass, more than enough for a hearty lunch. As I cleaned the fish back at camp, I found myself smiling, remembering weekends spent teaching Clara how to fillet our catch. She'd always been squeamish about it but determined to learn. After lunch, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The woods were dense, old-growth timber creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. I marked my path with bright orange surveyor tape, an old habit from my early days on construction sites. It felt good to be moving, to feel the give of soft earth beneath my boots instead of unyielding concrete. As the afternoon wore on, I began to notice small things that seemed off. Nothing I could put my finger on, just a growing sense of unease that prickled at the back of my neck. The bird calls, which had been a constant backdrop all day, grew less frequent. The underbrush seemed thicker, more tangled, as if actively resisting my passage. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination, too many years in the city making me jumpy in real wilderness. Still, I decided to head back to camp earlier than planned. Better safe than sorry, especially out here where help was hours away at best. That night, as I sat by the fire nursing a beer, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The darkness beyond the circle of firelight seemed deeper, more absolute than it should have been. Twice I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. Years of managing job sites had beaten any tendency toward the superstitious out of me. But sitting there with the fire casting flickering shadows and the forest pressing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by strange dreams. I woke several times, certain I'd heard something moving outside the RV. Each time I peered out the windows, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing beyond the normal nighttime activity of the forest. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, a fine mist hanging in the air. I went through my morning routine mechanically, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As I made my way down to the lake, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There at the water's edge were tracks, not the familiar prints of deer or raccoon, but something larger, with a gait that seemed wrong somehow. The prints were deep, suggesting considerable weight, but the spacing was off for any animal I knew. They led into the water and disappeared. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bear maybe? But no bear I'd ever encountered moved like that. And there was something about the shape of the prints that set my teeth on edge. For the first time since arriving, I seriously considered packing up and leaving. But the rational part of my brain rebelled at the idea. I was a grown man, for Christ's sake, not some kid scared of shadows. Whatever had made those tracks was just an animal, probably more afraid of me than I was of it. Still, as I pushed the boat out onto the lake, I couldn't help but scan the shoreline, half expecting to see something watching me from the tree line. The day passed slowly, the overcast sky making it difficult to gauge the passage of time. I caught nothing, the lake unnaturally still and quiet. It was late afternoon by the time I gave up and headed back to shore. As I secured the boat, I noticed more tracks, fresh ones leading up from the water and disappearing into the underbrush. My heart rate picked up, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the cool air. I hurried back to camp, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The clearing seemed smaller somehow, the trees looming closer than I remembered. I busied myself with mundane tasks, gathering firewood, checking my supplies, anything to keep my mind occupied and away from wild speculation. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound, every shift of shadow. The fire seemed smaller, weaker, barely holding back the encroaching darkness. I kept the shotgun close at hand, telling myself it was just a precaution against bears or mountain lions. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew that whatever was out there in the woods was something far more dangerous than any natural predator. It was just after midnight when I heard it, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it might be distant thunder, but the sky had been clear when I turned in for the night. As I lay there in the darkness of the RV, straining my ears, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't any sound I'd ever heard before. It was alive somehow, a deep, resonant growl that I could feel in my chest more than hear. My heart began to race, adrenaline flooding my system as every instinct screamed danger. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, my hand shaking slightly as I fumbled with the switch. The beam cut through the darkness of the RV, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of my vision. The growl outside intensified, closer now. I could hear something moving through the underbrush, branches snapping under immense weight. Whatever it was big, bigger than any bear I'd ever encountered. I grabbed the shotgun, checking that it was loaded with trembling hands. Part of me wanted to stay put, to hide in the relative safety of the RV and pray that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. But a deeper, more primal part of me needed to see, to confront whatever threat was lurking in the darkness. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I eased the RV's door open and stepped outside. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something musky and alien. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light across the clearing. Beyond that small circle of illumination, the forest was a wall of impenetrable darkness. I swept the flashlight beam across the tree line, my grip on the shotgun tightening with each passing second. And then I saw it. At first it was just a suggestion of movement, a deeper patch of shadow shifting between the trees. But as it emerged into the clearing, I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall at the shoulder. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, but there was something off about its proportions. The limbs were too long, too fluid in their movements. It moved on all fours but with an unsettling grace that spoke of barely contained power. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. Where there should have been a snout, there was only a flat expanse of leathery skin, broken by a wide, lipless mouth filled with jagged teeth. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They glowed with an unnatural amber light, filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the clearing. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the plumes of vapor in the cool night air. The creature's chest heaved with each breath, a low growl rumbling from deep within its massive frame. And then it charged. I barely had time to react, diving to the side as the creature barreled past me. I felt the rush of air as it missed me by inches, heard the crunch of gravel under its massive paws. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I ran for the RV, not daring to look back. I could hear the creature behind me, its growls now mixed with a high-pitched keening that set my teeth on edge. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, all I could do was stand there gasping for breath, my whole body trembling. Outside, I could hear the creature circling the RV, its massive body brushing against the sides. The whole vehicle shook with each impact, and I was sure that at any moment it would find a way in. But it didn't. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sounds began to fade. The creature's footsteps grew fainter, moving away from the RV and back into the woods. Eventually, silence fell once more, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there in the dark, shotgun across my lap, jumping at every creak and groan of the forest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It wasn't possible. Creatures like that didn't exist outside of horror movies and campfire stories. And yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever that thing was, it seemed to be nocturnal. I was safe for now. But I knew I couldn't stay. This place, whatever secrets it held, was far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I needed to get out, to get back to civilization. And what then? Tell people about the monster in the woods? Who would believe me? I shook my head, pushing those thoughts aside. Right now, all that mattered was getting out of here alive. I could worry about the rest later. With shaking hands, I began to pack up my gear, constantly glancing out the windows for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful in the early morning light. But I knew better now. I knew what lurked in the shadows, waiting for nightfall. As I stowed the last of my supplies, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. I froze, my hand tightening on the shotgun. But it wasn't the creature returning. It was a man. He stood at the tree line, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes that hung loosely on his frame. His skin was pale, almost gray in the early morning light. And his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. A wildness that spoke of madness or something worse. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the clearing. I felt a chill run down my spine, a certainty that this man, whoever he was connected to the horrors I'd experienced. Maybe he was its victim, driven mad by encounters with the creature. Or maybe he was something else entirely. I didn't wait to find out. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the gas. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose gravel before finding purchase. As I sped out of the clearing, I caught one last glimpse of the man in my rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, his eyes still fixed on me with that unsettling intensity. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I kept expecting to see the creature burst out of the woods, or the strange man appear on the road ahead. But there was nothing, just mile after mile of winding forest road. It wasn't until I reached the small town on the outskirts of the national forest that I finally allowed myself to relax. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I cut the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there trying to process everything that had happened. I stumbled out of the RV, my legs weak and unsteady. The bright fluorescent lights of the gas station felt harsh after days in the forest's filtered sunlight. A few early morning customers gave me curious looks as I made my way inside, but I barely noticed them. The young woman behind the counter eyed me warily as I approached. I must have looked a sight, unshaven, clothes rumpled, eyes wild with lack of sleep and residual fear. "Coffee?" I managed to croak out. "Largest you've got." She nodded, filling a styrofoam cup with steaming black liquid. I cradled it in my hands, savoring the warmth and familiar aroma. It was a small piece of normality, an anchor to the world I knew. As I sipped the coffee, my mind raced. What was I supposed to do now? Go to the police? They'd never believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. The events of the past night felt increasingly surreal in the harsh light of day. I must have been lost in thought longer than I realized, because suddenly the cashier was at my elbow, concern etched on her young face. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" I blinked, focusing on her. For a moment, I was tempted to spill everything, to unburden myself of the terrifying experiences I'd just been through. But the words died in my throat. How could I possibly explain? "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Just tired from the drive. Long night." She nodded, not looking entirely convinced, but stepped back behind the counter. I finished my coffee in silence, trying to decide what to do next. In the end, I decided to head home. I needed time to process, to try and make sense of what had happened. The drive back to Charlotte passed in a blur of highway miles and scattered thoughts. As I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house brought a wave of relief so strong it was almost painful. I was home. I was safe. But even as I showered away the grime of the past few days and collapsed into my own bed, I knew that safe was an illusion. The creature I'd seen, the strange man in the woods, they had shattered my understanding of the world. How could I ever feel truly safe again, knowing what lurked in the dark places of the world? The next few weeks passed in a haze. I threw myself back into work, taking on extra hours and projects to keep my mind occupied. But the memories of that night haunted me. I found myself jumping at shadows, scanning the tree line whenever I was outside. I tried to research, spending long nights hunched over my computer, searching for any similar accounts. There were stories, of course, tales of Bigfoot sightings and other cryptids. But nothing that matched what I'd seen. Nothing that explained the wrongness of the creature, or the unsettling presence of the man in the woods. As the weeks turned to months, the intensity of the memories began to fade. There were moments when I could almost convince myself it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Almost. But then I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight, or wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman growl ringing in my ears. And I'd know with bone-deep certainty that it had all been real. I never went back to Fontana Lake. I sold the RV, unable to look at it without remembering that terrifying night. My fishing gear gathered dust in the garage. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, once a source of peace, now filled me with dread. But life, as they say, goes on. Slowly I began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the constant fear fading to a background hum of caution. I found new hobbies, ones that kept me firmly in the realm of civilization. And yet, there's a part of me that can never fully let go, a part that knows the world is bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than most people realize. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that clearing in the woods, about the creature and the strange man. And I wonder, are they still out there lurking in the shadows of Fontana Lake? How many other dark secrets does the world hold just out of sight of our everyday lives? I don't have answers. I'm not sure I want them. But I know one thing for certain. The next time someone suggests a quiet getaway in the woods, I'll be staying home. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unexplored. It's been 5 years since that night at Fontana Lake. Life has settled into a new normal. I retired from construction work last year, the physical toll of decades on job sites finally catching up with me. These days, I keep busy with volunteer work at the local community center, teaching kids basic carpentry skills. I've never spoken about what happened in those woods. Who would believe me? But sometimes when I'm working with the kids, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, or a flash of amber in a dark corner. It's gone when I turn to look, of course. Just a trick of the light, I tell myself. But late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows seem to stretch and move, I wonder. I think about the creature, about the strange man in the woods. And I can't help but feel that somehow, someday, our paths will cross again. Until then, I keep a nightlight burning and a loaded shotgun by my bed. Just in case. Because once you've seen behind the veil of our everyday world, you can never truly unsee it. And you can never be too careful. After all, who knows what might be lurking in the shadows just beyond the light? I remember my mom used to say that life is a series of calculated risks, and I always thought she was right. I'm Brett McAllister, a guy who has spent most of his life calculating those risks. A mechanical engineer by trade, I've always believed in the reliability of numbers and the precision of machines. But numbers and machines couldn't prepare me for what I encountered in the Oregon wilderness. The fluorescent lights of my office buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of the monotony that had become my life. I stared at the computer screen, my eyes struggling to focus on the endless rows of data before me. The hum of the air conditioning unit provided a sterile backdrop to the rhythmic tapping of keyboards around me. McAllister, a voice called out, breaking my concentration. I looked up to see my supervisor, Dave, standing at the entrance to my cubicle. His face wore its usual expression of mild disapproval. Yeah, I responded, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. Those reports need to be on my desk by 5, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And don't forget about the team meeting tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the new project timeline. I nodded, suppressing a sigh. Got it, Dave. I'll have everything ready. As he walked away, I felt a familiar weight settle on my shoulders. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself. Sure, the pay was good and the work was stable, but where was the excitement? The challenge? The sense of purpose? I glanced at the calendar on my desk, my eyes drawn to the circled dates at the end of the week. I had almost forgotten about the vacation days I had requested months ago. A plan began to form in my mind, a chance to break free from the suffocating routine, if only for a few days. That evening, as I finished up the reports and emailed them to Dave, I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend my hard-earned time off sitting at home, watching mindless TV and ordering takeout. No, I needed something more, something to remind me that there was still adventure to be found in the world. I opened my laptop and began researching camping spots in Oregon. The Tillamook State Forest caught my eye, vast, rugged, and relatively unknown to me. It was perfect. I could take my RV, spend a few days in the wilderness, and reconnect with the part of myself that had been slowly suffocating under fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets. As I made my plans, a voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. It sounded suspiciously like my mother's voice, reminding me of her favorite saying about calculated risks. But I pushed it aside. What risk could there be in a simple camping trip? Little did I know, as I packed my bags and prepared for my journey, that I was about to take the biggest risk of my life, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and myself. The drive to Tillamook State Forest was long but invigorating. As I left the city behind, I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to rolling hills and farmland, and then to the dense green canopy of the forest. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the trees stretch toward the sky like silent sentinels, and the quiet that settles over everything like a comforting blanket. It's peaceful, and peace is hard to come by these days. As I navigated the winding roads leading into the heart of the forest, I felt a sense of anticipation building within me. The forest was dense, a mix of Douglas firs and western hemlocks that towered above me, creating a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The roads were rough and narrow, winding through the hills like a snake. But the drive was worth it. The further I went, the more I felt like I was leaving the worries of my everyday life behind. After a couple of hours of careful driving, I found a small clearing just off a forgotten logging road, tucked away from any potential campers. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by the raw beauty of nature. I maneuvered my RV into position, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out of the RV, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. The forest around me was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant call of birds, the soft bubbling of a nearby stream. It was a far cry from the artificial hum of office life. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp and exploring my surroundings. I hiked along barely visible trails, my boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground. The forest was teeming with life, birds flitting between branches, squirrels chattering as they scampered up tree trunks, and once I even caught a glimpse of a deer, its ears perked up in alert before it bounded away into the undergrowth. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of insignificance in the face of such ancient, towering trees. Some of these giants had probably been standing here long before I was born, and would likely continue to stand long after I was gone. It was a humbling thought. I took photos as I explored, trying to capture the essence of the forest, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor, the intricate patterns of moss and lichen on tree bark, the delicate beauty of wildflowers peeking out from between fallen logs. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I started a fire in the small pit I had prepared earlier, the flames casting a warm, flickering light across the campsite. I roasted a couple of hot dogs over the fire, their sizzling a pleasant counterpoint to the crackling of the flames. As I sat back in my fold-out chair with a cold beer in hand, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. This was what I had been missing. This connection to nature, this sense of solitude and peace. As the night deepened, the noises of the forest became more pronounced. The chirping of crickets created a constant background hum, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small nocturnal creature in the underbrush. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. I leaned back in my chair, gazing up at the sky. Away from the city lights, the stars were incredibly bright, a dazzling array of pinpricks against the velvet blackness of the night sky. I could make out constellations I hadn't seen since I was a kid: Orion's Belt, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. As I sat there, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. The stress of work, the pressures of everyday life, they all seemed so distant, so insignificant in the face of this vast, ancient forest. I thought about my mother's words about calculated risks, and I smiled to myself. Sometimes the best things in life came from taking a chance, from stepping out of your comfort zone. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered, that the forest I found so calming was hiding secrets darker and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I sat there, blissfully unaware, something was stirring in the depths of the woods, something that would change my life forever. I'm not sure when I first noticed that something was off. Maybe it was the way the forest sounds seemed to change, becoming muted and strange, or perhaps it was a shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure that made my ears pop. Whatever it was, it pulled me out of my peaceful reverie, leaving me with a vague sense of unease. I sat up straighter in my chair, my eyes scanning the tree line. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. The darkness beyond seemed more intense, more alive somehow. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Something I couldn't quite place. It was a low, rumbling noise like the growl of an engine, but deeper, more primal. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind moving through the trees in a peculiar way. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by a series of thuds like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stood up, my heart rate picking up as I strained to see into the darkness beyond the firelight. My mind raced through the possibilities, maybe a bear, I thought, or a cougar. Something like that. But even as I considered these options, I knew they didn't quite fit. I've been around enough animals to know what they sound like, and this was different. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight from the RV and swept the beam across the edge of the clearing. The trees cast long, flickering shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to convince myself that my imagination was running wild, I heard the sound again. This time it was unmistakable, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. And it was close. Very close. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it was watching me. I could feel it. The weight of its gaze was almost palpable, pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew I should go back inside, lock the door, and wait it out. That would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity, or maybe something deeper, a need to confront whatever was out there. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I took a step forward, sweeping the flashlight beam in a wide arc. The light caught on something, a flash of movement between the trees. Something large, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I called again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Show yourself." For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, I heard the crashing of branches, followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. The scream wasn't human, at least not entirely. It had a sharp, almost metallic edge to it, like the grinding of gears. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight in my shock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to make a decision fast. That's when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, a massive shape moved between the trees. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. I caught only glimpses, a flash of matted fur, the glint of what might have been teeth or claws, eyes that reflected the light like polished metal. My breath caught in my throat as the light fell fully on the creature. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark and bristling like the quills of a porcupine. But it wasn't the fur that froze me in place, it was the size. This thing was enormous, easily over 8 feet tall, with a hulking muscular frame that rippled with every movement. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And then I saw its face, or at least what I thought was its face. A grotesque, twisted snout that resembled a wild boar's, with tusks jutting out on either side like jagged knives. But the worst part was its mouth. It was wide, almost impossibly wide, lined with rows of teeth that seemed to glint in the flashlight's beam. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature born from the darkest corners of the earth. For a moment, we just stare. I remember my mom used to say that life is a series of calculated risks, and I always thought she was right. I'm Brett McAllister, a guy who has spent most of his life calculating those risks. A mechanical engineer by trade, I've always believed in the reliability of numbers and the precision of machines. But numbers and machines couldn't prepare me for what I encountered in the Oregon wilderness. The fluorescent lights of my office buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of the monotony that had become my life. I stared at the computer screen, my eyes struggling to focus on the endless rows of data before me. The hum of the air conditioning unit provided a sterile backdrop to the rhythmic tapping of keyboards around me. "McAllister," a voice called out, breaking my concentration. I looked up to see my supervisor, Dave, standing at the entrance to my cubicle. His face wore its usual expression of mild disapproval. "Yeah," I responded, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. "Those reports need to be on my desk by 5, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And don't forget about the team meeting tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the new project timeline. I nodded, suppressing a sigh. Got it, Dave. I'll have everything ready. As he walked away, I felt a familiar weight settle on my shoulders. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself. Sure, the pay was good and the work was stable, but where was the excitement? The challenge? The sense of purpose? I glanced at the calendar on my desk, my eyes drawn to the circled dates at the end of the week. I had almost forgotten about the vacation days I had requested months ago. A plan began to form in my mind, a chance to break free from the suffocating routine, if only for a few days. That evening, as I finished up the reports and emailed them to Dave, I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend my hard-earned time off sitting at home, watching mindless TV and ordering takeout. No, I needed something more, something to remind me that there was still adventure to be found in the world. I opened my laptop and began researching camping spots in Oregon. The Tillamook State Forest caught my eye, vast, rugged, and relatively unknown to me. It was perfect. I could take my RV, spend a few days in the wilderness, and reconnect with the part of myself that had been slowly suffocating under fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets. As I made my plans, a voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. It sounded suspiciously like my mother's voice, reminding me of her favorite saying about calculated risks. But I pushed it aside. What risk could there be in a simple camping trip? Little did I know, as I packed my bags and prepared for my journey, that I was about to take the biggest risk of my life, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and myself. The drive to Tillamook State Forest was long but invigorating. As I left the city behind, I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to rolling hills and farmland, and then to the dense green canopy of the forest. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the trees stretch toward the sky like silent sentinels, and the quiet that settles over everything like a comforting blanket. It's peaceful, and peace is hard to come by these days. As I navigated the winding roads leading into the heart of the forest, I felt a sense of anticipation building within me. The forest was dense, a mix of Douglas firs and western hemlocks that towered above me, creating a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The roads were rough and narrow, winding through the hills like a snake. But the drive was worth it. The further I went, the more I felt like I was leaving the worries of my everyday life behind. After a couple of hours of careful driving, I found a small clearing just off a forgotten logging road, tucked away from any potential campers. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by the raw beauty of nature. I maneuvered my RV into position, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out of the RV, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. The forest around me was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant call of birds, the soft bubbling of a nearby stream. It was a far cry from the artificial hum of office life. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp and exploring my surroundings. I hiked along barely visible trails, my boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground. The forest was teeming with life, birds flitting between branches, squirrels chattering as they scampered up tree trunks, and once I even caught a glimpse of a deer, its ears perked up in alert before it bounded away into the undergrowth. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of insignificance in the face of such ancient, towering trees. Some of these giants had probably been standing here long before I was born and would likely continue to stand long after I was gone. It was a humbling thought. I took photos as I explored, trying to capture the essence of the forest, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor, the intricate patterns of moss and lichen on tree bark, the delicate beauty of wildflowers peeking out from between fallen logs. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I started a fire in the small pit I had prepared earlier, the flames casting a warm, flickering light across the campsite. I roasted a couple of hot dogs over the fire, their sizzling a pleasant counterpoint to the crackling of the flames. As I sat back in my fold-out chair with a cold beer in hand, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. This was what I had been missing, this connection to nature, this sense of solitude and peace. As the night deepened, the noises of the forest became more pronounced. The chirping of crickets created a constant background hum, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small nocturnal creature in the underbrush. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. I leaned back in my chair, gazing up at the sky. Away from the city lights, the stars were incredibly bright, a dazzling array of pinpricks against the velvet blackness of the night sky. I could make out constellations I hadn't seen since I was a kid: Orion's Belt, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. As I sat there, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. The stress of work, the pressures of everyday life, they all seemed so distant, so insignificant in the face of this vast, ancient forest. I thought about my mother's words about calculated risks, and I smiled to myself. Sometimes the best things in life came from taking a chance, from stepping out of your comfort zone. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered, that the forest I found so calming was hiding secrets darker and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I sat there, blissfully unaware, something was stirring in the depths of the woods. Something that would change my life forever. I'm not sure when I first noticed that something was off. Maybe it was the way the forest sounds seemed to change, becoming muted and strange. Or perhaps it was a shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure that made my ears pop. Whatever it was, it pulled me out of my peaceful reverie, leaving me with a vague sense of unease. I sat up straighter in my chair, my eyes scanning the tree line. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. The darkness beyond seemed more intense, more alive somehow. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Something I couldn't quite place. It was a low, rumbling noise like the growl of an engine, but deeper, more primal. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind moving through the trees in a peculiar way. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by a series of thuds, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stood up, my heart rate picking up as I strained to see into the darkness beyond the firelight. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe a bear, I thought, or a cougar. Something like that. But even as I considered these options, I knew they didn't quite fit. I've been around enough animals to know what they sound like, and this was different. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight from the RV and swept the beam across the edge of the clearing. The trees cast long, flickering shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to convince myself that my imagination was running wild, I heard the sound again. This time it was unmistakable, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. And it was close. Very close. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it was watching me. I could feel it. The weight of its gaze was almost palpable, pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew I should go back inside, lock the door, and wait it out. That would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity, or maybe something deeper. A need to confront whatever was out there. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I took a step forward, sweeping the flashlight beam in a wide arc. The light caught on something, a flash of movement between the trees. Something large, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I called again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Show yourself." For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, I heard the crashing of branches, followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. The scream wasn't human, at least not entirely. It had a sharp, almost metallic edge to it, like the grinding of gears. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight in my shock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I knew I had to make a decision fast. That's when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, a massive shape moved between the trees. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. I caught only glimpses, a flash of matted fur, the glint of what might have been teeth or claws, eyes that reflected the light like polished metal. My breath caught in my throat as the light fell fully on the creature. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark and bristling like the quills of a porcupine. But it wasn't the fur that froze me in place, it was the size. This thing was enormous, easily over 8 feet tall, with a hulking, muscular frame that rippled with every movement. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And then I saw its face, or at least what I thought was its face. A grotesque, twisted snout that resembled a wild boar's, with tusks jutting out on either side like jagged knives. But the worst part was its mouth. It was wide, almost impossibly wide, lined with rows of teeth that seemed to glint in the flashlight's beam. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature born from the darkest corners of the earth. For a moment we just stared at each other, me rooted to the spot in terror, and this thing, its chest heaving with each breath, a low growl emanating from its throat. Then, as if a spell had been broken, it moved. It was coming toward me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I dropped the flashlight and bolted for the RV, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. The ground was uneven and I stumbled more than once, my feet catching on exposed roots and loose rocks. But I didn't dare look back. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush with a terrifying speed that made my blood run cold. The distance to the RV seemed to stretch impossibly. Every step I took felt like I was running through molasses, the vehicle not getting any closer. I could hear my own ragged breathing, feel the burn in my lungs as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. Behind me, the creature let out another of those blood-curdling screams. It sounded closer now, much closer. I could almost feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Imagine those razor-sharp claws reaching out for me. I reached the RV, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled with the door handle. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it was locked, that I had trapped myself out here with this monstrosity. But then the door swung open and I practically dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I could hear the creature outside, circling the RV, its claws scraping against the metal exterior. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge. Somehow I managed to start the engine. It roared to life and I floored the gas pedal, not even bothering to buckle my seatbelt. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. I tore down the narrow road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle, the steering wheel vibrating in my white-knuckled grip. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisting path ahead in brief, terrifying flashes. But the creature wasn't done with me. In the rearview mirror, I saw it burst out of the tree line, its eyes, or whatever they were, glinting in the darkness. It was gaining on me, its massive limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. I pushed the RV harder, taking curves at speeds that had the vehicle tilting dangerously. But it wasn't enough. The thing kept coming, relentless, unstoppable. I knew there was no outrunning it, not on this road, not in this vehicle. And then, without warning, it leaped, a massive, impossible leap that carried it over the RV, landing with a thud in front of me. I swerved, barely missing it, but the RV hit a patch of loose gravel and skidded sideways. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the tree rushing toward me, felt the wheels spinning uselessly in my hands. There was a moment of clarity, a strange calm in the eye of the storm, where I thought, so this is how it ends. Then impact. The RV crashed into the tree with a sickening crunch of metal and breaking glass. The airbag deployed, slamming into my face with enough force to make me see stars. My head whipped forward, then back, slamming into the headrest. For a moment, everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine had cut out, leaving only the hiss of steam escaping from the crumpled hood. My head was throbbing and I could feel something warm trickling down my forehead. Blood, I realized dimly. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, and through it I could see the tree I'd hit, its bark scraped and torn from the impact. But beyond that, nothing. No sign of the creature. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that the stress of work, the isolation of the forest, had caused some kind of mental break? But no. The pain in my head, the wreckage of the RV, these were real. And so was what I had seen. Slowly, painfully, I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to open the driver's side door. It was jammed. I had to climb over to the passenger side, wincing as my battered body protested every movement. As I stumbled out of the RV, the full extent of the damage became clear. The front was crumpled like an accordion, steam still hissing from the ruined engine. It was a miracle I'd survived at all. The forest was silent again, the only sound the crackling of the damaged engine cooling down. I half expected the creature to come charging out of the trees again, to finish what it had started. But the forest remained still. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the wreckage, trying to piece together what had happened. My mind was a fog, the events of the night swirling together in a chaotic blur. But one thing was clear, I couldn't stay there. With shaking hands, I gathered what little I could from the RV. A flashlight, my phone, miraculously unbroken, a bottle of water, and a jacket. Then, casting one last nervous glance at the dark forest around me, I started walking. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of gravel cutting through the inky blackness of the forest. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I kept the flashlight on, sweeping it from side to side as I walked, though part of me was terrified of what it might reveal. I tried to use my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course not, I thought bitterly. That would be too easy. As I walked, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. The creature I'd seen, it defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. Its size, its speed, the way it moved, it was like something out of a nightmare. But it had been real. I had the bruises and cuts to prove it. I don't know how long I walked, hours probably. The sky began to lighten, the deep black giving way to a murky pre-dawn gray. As the light grew, my fear began to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a building in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a small, rundown gas station. It looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. But at that moment, it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I practically stumbled through the door, the bell above it jingling cheerfully, completely at odds with my disheveled and battered appearance. The attendant, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked at me like I was a ghost. His eyes widened as he took in my blood-stained face and torn clothes. "Jesus, son," he said, already reaching for the phone. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to tell him, to spill out the whole terrifying story. But as I stood there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, surrounded by racks of snack foods and coolers of soft drinks, the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? "Car accident," I managed to croak out. "My RV, it's totaled. Can you call the police? I need to report the accident." The attendant nodded, already dialing. As he spoke to the dispatcher, I sank into a plastic chair by the window, my body finally giving in to exhaustion. Through the grimy glass, I could see the forest in the distance. In the light of day, it looked peaceful, even beautiful. But I knew better now. I knew what secrets those trees held. The police arrived about an hour later, 2 officers in a patrol car, looking bored and a little skeptical. I gave them a vague story about swerving to avoid a deer, about losing control of the RV. They bought it, or at least they didn't question me further. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. McAllister," one of the officers said as he finished taking my statement. "That road can be treacherous, especially at night." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. If only they knew how lucky I really was. They arranged for a tow truck to retrieve the RV and offered to give me a ride to the nearest town, where I could rent a car. As we drove away from the gas station, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. In the morning light, it looked so normal, so innocuous. But I knew the truth now. I knew what lurked in its depths. The next few days passed in a blur. I gave a statement to my insurance company, arranged for a rental car, and started the long drive back home. I should have felt relieved to be putting distance between myself and Tillamook State Forest, but instead I felt unsettled. What I had seen that night, it changed everything. The world I thought I knew, the reality I had always taken for granted, had been shattered. There were things out there, things that defied explanation, that shouldn't exist but did. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had hit my head harder than I thought in the crash. Maybe the isolation and the darkness had played tricks on my mind. But deep down I knew the truth. What I had seen was real. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I spent hours researching. I scoured the internet for any reports of strange sightings in Tillamook State Forest, for any legends or myths that might explain what I had encountered. I found a few vague stories, hikers who had heard strange noises, campers who had felt like they were being watched, but nothing concrete, nothing that came close to what I had experienced. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to return to my normal life. I went back to work, sat through meetings, filled out reports. But everything felt different now. The fluorescent lights of the office seemed harsher, the cubicle walls more confining. The world I had known, the life I had lived, suddenly felt small and insignificant in the face of what I now knew existed. I haven't been back to the Tillamook State Forest since that night. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I hear that sound again, that low rumbling noise that doesn't belong in this world. And I wonder about what's really out there, hiding in the shadows of our world. I wonder about the things we don't know, the creatures that exist beyond the edges of our understanding. And I wonder if someday they'll step out of the shadows and into the light. But mostly, I wonder if I'll be ready when they do. Because one thing is certain, the world is a much stranger and more terrifying place than I ever imagined. And the next time I hear my mom's voice in my head, reminding me that life is a series of calculated risks, I'll remember that some risks can't be calculated, some dangers can't be predicted, and some encounters change you forever. It's been a year since that night in Tillamook State Forest. On the surface, my life has returned to normal. I still go to work every day, still live in the same apartment, still hang out with the same friends. But underneath it all, everything has changed. I've become obsessed with the unknown, with the unexplained. My bookshelves are now filled with tomes on cryptozoology, on folklore and urban legends. I spend my weekends combing through online forums, looking for stories similar to mine, for any hint that others have seen what I saw. I've found a few vague accounts, mostly a hiker in the Pacific Northwest who claims to have seen a creature that matches my description, a group of campers in Northern California who heard strange noises in the night. Nothing concrete, nothing I can prove, but enough to keep me searching. I thought about going public with my story, about telling the world what I saw. But who would believe me? I'd be labeled a crackpot, a hoaxer. My career would be over, my life as I know it finished. So I keep it to myself, this terrible, wonderful secret. But I can't stay away forever. The forest calls to me, a siren song I can't ignore. I find myself planning another trip, another chance to seek out the truth. I know it's dangerous, I might not come back. But I have to know. I have to understand. As I pack my bag, checking and double-checking my supplies, I think about my mother's words again. Life is a series of calculated risks. But some risks are worth taking no matter the cost. Because sometimes the truth is more important than safety. Sometimes the need to know outweighs the fear of what you might find. So I'll go back to Tillamook State Forest. I'll face whatever is waiting for me there. And maybe, just maybe, I'll finally get the answers I'm looking for. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Not the fear, not the danger, but the search for truth. The quest to understand the world around us, no matter how strange or terrifying it might be. And as I lock my apartment door behind me, ready to embark on this new journey, I can't help but smile. Because for the first time in a long time, I feel alive, really, truly alive. Whatever happens next, whatever I find in those woods, I know one thing for certain. The adventure is just beginning. It's funny how I ended up here in the middle of nowhere, doing something I swore I'd never do. You see, I've always been more of a city guy, the kind who enjoys the hum of traffic, the glow of street lights, and the comfort of knowing a bodega is just around the corner. My name is Arthur Melvin, and I was an investment banker, a workaholic who never took a break. Until I was forced to. The heart attack wasn't severe, but it was enough to make my doctor insist on time away from the office. So after some soul-searching and pressure from my family, I bought an RV and hit the road, determined to find peace in nature. I figured, why not try camping? Maybe it would do me some good. That's how I found myself in the deep woods of West Virginia, miles away from anything remotely civilized. The Monongahela National Forest, a name that was hard enough to pronounce, let alone appreciate. The forest was vast, dense, and eerily quiet, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company. At first, it was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The air was crisp, the trees were towering, and the sky, when visible through the canopy, was a deep blue I hadn't seen in years. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a small stream, far enough from the usual campsites to avoid any intrusions. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day went by uneventfully. I hiked a bit, read a book, and tried my hand at fishing unsuccessfully, of course. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire and cooked some canned beans. It was all very rustic, and I almost enjoyed it. Almost. Night fell quickly in the forest, and with it came a silence so profound that it felt oppressive. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your thoughts grow louder. I was just settling into my RV, preparing to call it a night, when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other harmless creature, but the sound grew closer, heavier, like something large was moving through the underbrush. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows and the occasional glint of light reflecting off leaves. The rustling stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the RV door, checked it twice, and went to bed feeling a bit silly for being spooked by the wilderness. The next day, I decided to hike a little farther from the campsite, maybe explore some of the less traveled trails. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set out, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, winding through dense trees and over rocky terrain. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was absurd, of course. There was no one out here, no signs of other campers or hikers, just me in the forest. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon something odd. A clearing, circular and unnaturally perfect, as if the trees had been cut down deliberately to make space. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, low to the ground and covered in moss. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book, maybe a forgotten altar or shrine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, noticing strange carvings on the stones, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deeply into the rock. I reached out to touch one, feeling the roughness of the stone under my fingers, when I heard it again, only this time it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy was hitting the ground repeatedly. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe an animal, but there was nothing. The clearing was empty save for the trees that encircled it like silent sentinels. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, in a clearing that suddenly felt much less inviting. I decided to head back to the RV, quickening my pace, the sense of unease growing with every step. When I returned to the campsite, everything was as I had left it. The fire pit was cold, the RV untouched, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had intensified. I spent the rest of the day close to the RV, not wanting to venture out again. As dusk fell, I started a fire, hoping the flames would bring some comfort. They didn't. The night was darker than before, the shadows deeper, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I heard the rustling again, closer this time, and that same thumping noise. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but no explanation seemed to fit. I retreated into the RV, locking the door once more and checking all the windows. I had a small hunting knife with me, a last-minute purchase at a roadside shop, and I kept it close, feeling more ridiculous by the minute. But then the RV shook. Not a slight tremor, but a forceful jolt, as if something had rammed into it. I froze, gripping the knife, waiting for another impact. It came seconds later, harder this time, accompanied by a screeching sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to see what was out there, but I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever it was to break in. I had to do something. My mind raced through options, but none of them seemed feasible. Running into the woods was out of the question. I didn't even know what was out there. Staying in the RV felt like a death sentence. The creature, because that's what it had to be, a creature of some kind, was ramming the RV with increasing force, each impact causing the metal to groan and creak. In a burst of adrenaline, I threw open the RV door and bolted out, knife in hand, running in the direction of the clearing. I didn't know why I chose that direction. Maybe because it was the only place I knew, or maybe because some instinct told me to go there. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and I could barely see where I was going. But I could hear it, the thumping, the rustling, the heavy breathing of whatever was chasing me. I reached the clearing, panting and desperate, and for a moment, everything was silent. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Then, from the shadows, it emerged. A hulking figure covered in coarse, matted fur, standing on two legs like a man but with a face that was all wrong. It was like a wolf, but its features were distorted, stretched and twisted into something grotesque. Its eyes, God, those eyes, were wide and wild, reflecting the faint light of the moon. As it stepped closer, I backed away, heart pounding, knife trembling in my hand. The creature snarled, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the clearing. I knew I couldn't fight it, not with just a knife, but there was nowhere to run. The creature lunged at me, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. I barely had time to react, slashing wildly with the knife as it came at me. The blade connected with something solid, and the creature let out a howl of pain, but it didn't stop. It knocked me to the ground, the force of its attack sending the knife flying out of my hand. I struggled, kicking and punching, anything to keep those jaws away from my throat, but it was too strong, its weight pinning me down as it snapped at me, its breath hot and foul against my face. In a last-ditch effort, I reached for a rock, smashing it against the creature's head with all the strength I could muster. It recoiled, stunned, and I took the opportunity to scramble away, grabbing the knife as I went. I don't know what came over me, maybe it was the fear or the desperation, but I turned and charged at the creature, plunging the knife into its side. It let out another howl, thrashing violently, but I held on, driving the blade deeper. Blood, thick and dark, poured from the wound, covering my hands and the ground beneath us. The creature shuddered, its strength waning, and finally collapsed with a final, shuddering breath. I stood there, panting, covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of the creature at my feet. For a moment, I couldn't believe it was over, that I had actually survived. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight of the night lifting slightly. I stumbled back to the RV, knife still in hand, and sat down, my mind numb with shock. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the blood-stained knife, but eventually the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. I didn't feel relief, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I knew I had to leave, to get out of this place before anything else happened. But first, I needed to make sure it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I walked back to the clearing, half expecting the body to be gone, for the creature to have vanished like some nightmare. But it was there, massive and still, its fur matted with blood. In the light of day, it looked less monstrous but no less terrifying. I knew I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't risk anyone else finding it, or worse, more of its kind coming for it. With trembling hands, I began the gruesome task of burying the creature. It took hours, digging a shallow grave with nothing but a small camping shovel and my bare hands. As I worked, my mind raced with questions. What was this thing? How long had it been out here? Were there more? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something much bigger than I could comprehend. The stone structure in the clearing, the strange symbols, they had to be connected to this creature somehow. But how? And why? As I covered the last of the creature with dirt, I made a decision. I couldn't just leave and pretend this never happened. I needed answers. I needed to understand what I had seen, what I had done. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I hiked back to my RV, my body aching from the night's ordeal and the morning's labor. I packed up quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and this clearing. But I didn't leave the forest. Instead, I drove to the nearest ranger station, my mind already forming a plan. The ranger on duty, a grizzled man named Frank, looked at me with concern as I stumbled in, still covered in dirt and dried blood. I must have been a sight. I told him I had been attacked by a bear, that I had managed to fight it off but was badly shaken. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the whole truth. Not yet. Frank called in a search party, insisting that they needed to find the bear before it hurt someone else. I led them to the clearing, my heart pounding with each step. But when we arrived, the grave was empty. The disturbed earth was the only evidence that anything had happened there at all. The rangers were confused but not suspicious. They assumed the bear had been wounded but not killed, and that it had dragged itself away. They set up cameras in the area and warned me to stay out of the backcountry for a while. I nodded, feigning relief at their help, but inside I was reeling. I didn't leave West Virginia. Instead, I checked into a small motel in the nearest town, determined to find out more about what I had experienced. I spent days in the local library, poring over old newspapers, local history books, and folklore collections. I searched for any mention of strange creatures, unexplained disappearances, or unusual stone structures in the forest. At first, I found nothing concrete, just vague legends and campfire stories. But then, buried in a dusty tome of local history, I found something. A photograph from the early 1900s showing a group of loggers standing around a stone structure that looked eerily similar to the one I had seen in the clearing. The caption mentioned a curious old Indian relic, found deep in the forest. But there was something odd about the men in the photo. Their smiles seemed forced, their eyes haunted. One man, standing at the edge of the group, caught my attention. His face was blurred, as if he had moved during the exposure, but there was something about his posture, the way he seemed to be looking over his shoulder, that sent a chill down my spine. I dug deeper, cross-referencing names and dates. I discovered that several of the men in the photo had gone missing in the months following the picture's publication. The official reports cited workplace accidents, but the details were vague, the investigations cursory. As I delved further into the town's history, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be a spate of disappearances or unusual animal attacks. The incidents were always explained away: bears, mountain lions, tragic accidents, but the timing was too consistent to be coincidence. I reached out to a professor of anthropology at a nearby university, sharing some of what I had found under the guise of researching local folklore. He seemed intrigued by my questions about the stone structure and the symbols I had seen. "What you're describing," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with excitement, "sounds like it could be connected to some very old, very obscure Native American legends. There are stories of guardian spirits, creatures that protect sacred places. But these weren't always benevolent spirits. Some were said to be changed, corrupted." His words sent a shiver through me. I thanked him for his time and hung up, my mind racing. I was on to something, I was sure of it. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized how dangerous this knowledge could be. Weeks had passed since my encounter in the forest, but I couldn't let it go. The need for answers, for understanding, had become an obsession. I knew I had to go back. I had to see the clearing again, to examine the stone structure more closely. I waited for a clear night when the moon was full. I told myself it was for better visibility, but deep down, I knew it was because I was afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness. I parked my car at the trailhead and set out, my backpack loaded with supplies. Flashlights, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my trusty hunting knife. The forest was different at night. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. But I pressed on, following the faint trail back to the clearing. When I arrived, my breath caught in my throat. The stone structure was still there, but it looked different in the moonlight. The symbols seemed to shimmer as if they were alive. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing over the ancient stones. As I got closer, I realized what had changed. New symbols had been carved into the rock, crude and fresh compared to the weathered originals. With a jolt, I recognized one of them. It was the same shape as the wound I had inflicted on the creature. A twig snapped behind me and I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. For a moment, I thought it was the creature again, back from the dead. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a man, tall and lean, with long matted hair and wild eyes. He stared at me not with anger or aggression, but with a kind of desperate intensity. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if unused to forming words. "You've seen it?" It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. He took a step forward, and I saw that his clothes were tattered, his skin covered in dirt and old scars. "Then you know," he continued. "You know that it's not over. That it's never over." "What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask. "What is this place? What was that thing?" The man laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Thing? No, not a thing. A guardian. A protector. Or it was once before." He trailed off, his eyes losing focus for a moment before snapping back to me. "Before we corrupted it," he finished. "We?" I asked, taking a step closer despite my fear. "Who are you? What do you know about this?" The man sighed, suddenly looking very old and very tired. "My name is Robert Carlyle. I was part of a research team that came here decades ago. We thought we'd found something revolutionary, an ancient site of immense power. We were fools." Robert's story poured out of him as if he'd been waiting years to tell it. His team had discovered the clearing and the stone structure back in the 1980s. They were anthropologists and archaeologists, excited by the prospect of uncovering a previously unknown Native American site. But it was so much more than that. The symbols, the structure, Robert said, his voice trembling, they were a key, a lock. And we, in our arrogance, decided to open it. They had deciphered part of the symbols, enough to perform what they thought was an ancient ritual. But instead of revealing archaeological treasures, their actions had awakened something. The guardian, as Robert called it, a creature bound to the site for centuries, tasked with protecting it from intruders. "It wasn't evil, not at first," Robert explained. "But our presence, our meddling, it changed it, corrupted it, and then it started hunting." The story he told chilled me to the bone. The creature had decimated the research team, killing most and driving the rest into hiding or madness. Robert had been the only one to stay, feeling responsible for what they'd unleashed. "I've tried to stop it, to undo what we did," he said, gesturing to the new symbols on the stone. But it's not enough. It's never enough. As Robert's tale came to an end, I stood there trying to process everything I'd heard. It seemed impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But I had seen the creature with my own eyes, had fought it with my own hands. What can we do? I asked, surprising myself with the "we." But I knew I couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Robert looked at me, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. There might be a way, he said slowly. The original ritual, we never completed it. We thought we had, but there was a part we missed. A final step. He explained that the ritual was meant to bind the guardian to its purpose, to renew its connection to the land and its protective role. By interrupting it, they had severed that connection, leaving the creature unmoored and susceptible to corruption. If we could complete the ritual, Robert said, we might be able to restore the guardian to its original purpose. Or at least put it to rest. The plan was dangerous, bordering on insane. We would need to decipher the remaining symbols, gather the necessary components for the ritual, and somehow lure the creature back to the clearing, all while avoiding being killed by the very thing we were trying to save. But what choice did we have? I couldn't leave knowing that this creature was out there, that it might hurt more people. And Robert had been living with this guilt for decades. He deserved a chance to make things right. Over the next few weeks, Robert and I worked tirelessly to prepare for the ritual. We pored over his old notes, cross-referencing them with the books I'd found in the local library. Slowly, painfully, we began to piece together the final parts of the ritual. The components were difficult to gather. Some were simple, specific plants that grew in the forest, water from a particular stream. Others were more challenging, requiring us to dig deep into the earth near the stone structure, searching for buried artifacts. All the while, we were aware of the creature's presence. It never showed itself, but we could feel it watching us. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. More than once, I woke up in my tent, heart pounding, sure that I had heard the sound of heavy breathing just outside. Robert was convinced that the creature was aware of what we were doing. "It's afraid," he said one evening as we sat by the campfire. "It knows we're trying to change it, and it's afraid." I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. Finally, after what felt like months but was really only a few weeks, we were ready. We had deciphered the symbols, gathered the components, and steeled ourselves for what was to come. We chose to perform the ritual on the night of the new moon, when the forest would be at its darkest. As we made our way to the clearing, the air felt thick and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The stone structure seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy as we approached. We laid out our components, drew the necessary symbols on the ground with chalk and ash, and began the ritual. Robert took the lead, chanting words in a language I didn't understand. I followed his cues, adding my voice when needed, placing components in specific patterns around the stone. As the ritual progressed, the air began to change. It crackled with electricity, and I could have sworn I saw faint lights dancing between the trees. And then we heard it, the familiar sound of heavy footsteps drawing closer. The creature burst into the clearing with a roar that shook the trees. It was just as terrifying as I remembered, possibly more so. Its eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and fear as it charged toward us. Robert never faltered in his chanting, even as the creature bore down on us. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I held my ground. We were so close. We couldn't stop now. Just as the creature reached the edge of our ritual circle, something changed. The symbols we had drawn began to glow, a soft blue light that quickly intensified. The creature howled, but it sounded less like a roar of rage and more like a cry of pain. I watched in awe as the creature's form began to shift. The matted fur seemed to melt away, revealing something underneath that was both less and more than animal. It was as if I was seeing layers of time peeled back, revealing what the guardian had once been. Robert's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly everything went silent. The glowing symbols flared brightly, then faded. The creature, the guardian, stood motionless in the center of our circle. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the guardian turned its gaze to us. The eyes that had once been filled with rage now held something else: understanding, sadness, and perhaps a glimmer of gratitude. With a sound that was part sigh and part growl, the guardian's form began to dissolve. It was like watching mist evaporate in the morning sun. Within moments, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a feeling of profound emptiness. Robert and I stood in the clearing, breathing heavily, scarcely able to believe what we had just witnessed. The forest around us felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great burden had been lifted. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Robert nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "We've restored the balance. The guardian is at peace." As dawn broke over the forest, we began the task of clearing away the remnants of the ritual. We worked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew that I would never be the same after this experience. The world was bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But it was also more wondrous. As we prepared to leave the clearing for the last time, Robert turned to me. "Thank you," he said simply. "I couldn't have done this alone." I nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "What will you do now?" I asked. He looked around the clearing, a small smile on his face. "I think my work here is done," he said. "It's time for me to rejoin the world." As for me, I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. Not completely. The forest had changed me, shown me things I could never unsee. But I didn't regret it. I left the Monongahela National Forest with a newfound respect for the mysteries of the world and a determination to keep my eyes open to the wonders and dangers that might be lurking just out of sight. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The forest receded behind me, its secrets once again hidden beneath the canopy of ancient trees. But I knew they were there, and I knew that somewhere in the deepest part of the woods, a guardian rested, its vigil finally complete.